Queen Rena stood on the balcony of the Grand Palace, staring out into the star-filled sky. The silence of the night was both peaceful and haunting. A soft breeze brushed against her pale skin, but it did little to calm the heavy feeling in her chest. The once beautiful palace, built with the finest materials from across the galaxy, now felt cold and empty. Every corner, every room, every piece of furniture reminded her of the life she once had. A life full of hope, love, and dreams. But that was before everything changed. Before King Vorak had cast her aside. The king, her husband of over 20 years, had chosen to marry another woman. Young, fertile, and most importantly, able to bear him an heir. It had been a long time since Rena had given birth, and no matter how hard they tried, she had failed to provide him with a child. The Zethar people, her people, valued heirs above all else. Without a child, a ruler could not claim true power. Rena had known for years that her failure would not go unnoticed, but she never imagined it would cost her everything. The news had come as a shock, but also a deep wound. Vorak had claimed that it was not her fault, that her inability to have a child was simply a biological issue. But Rena knew better. He hadn't just chosen another wife for the sake of an heir. He had discarded her because she was no longer of use to him. The palace that had once been a symbol of their love now felt like a prison. She was a queen without a kingdom, a wife without a husband. The young woman who had replaced her, Mira, was everything that Rena was not. She was full of energy, with dark hair and bright eyes, her beauty youthful and fresh. Most importantly, Mira was fertile. The king had made his choice, and there was nothing Rena could do to change it. Rena's eyes wandered down to the distant, barren moon. She had been exiled there to live out the rest of her days in solitude, far from the people who once adored her. She was allowed to stay in the royal palace, but it was a hollow privilege. The moment she failed to provide an heir, she lost her place in the king's heart. She remembered the days when Vorak had been kind to her. They had laughed together, shared stories of their childhoods, and dreamed of ruling their people as equals. But that was before the pressure of heirs and bloodlines took over. Now, Rena was alone. She had not seen the king in weeks. The last time they spoke, he had explained, in a cold and distant voice, that it was time for him to move on. He had spoken of his new wife, and how she would bear him many children. His words had felt like knives, each one cutting deeper into her heart. Rena turned away from the balcony, her eyes scanning the empty halls of the palace. It felt like a lifetime since she had seen the vibrant halls filled with laughter and conversation. Now, it was all stillness. The only sound was the faint echo of her own footsteps. She felt like a ghost in her own home. As the days passed, Rena tried to keep herself busy. She read ancient Zethar texts, practiced meditation, and even explored the moon's desolate landscape. But nothing could fill the emptiness inside her. She had been abandoned by the one person she had trusted the most. One evening, as she wandered near the edge of the palace grounds, something strange caught her eye. A faint light flickered in the distance. It wasn't a star, nor was it one of the many ships that passed overhead. This light was much closer, and it seemed to be moving. Curiosity tugged at her. She hadn't seen anyone for months, but the idea of another presence, even an unfamiliar one, brought a spark of life to her weary heart. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to find something, someone, to help her forget the pain. She made her way toward the light, her steps quickening as she drew closer. The light grew brighter, revealing a figure standing on the rocky terrain. It was a man, his clothing torn and his face battered, as though he had been through a great ordeal. Rena stopped a few paces away from him, unsure what to do. He didn't look like a Zethar or any other species she recognized. He was human. He stumbled toward her, his eyes wide with confusion. He didn't seem to recognize her or even care about her royal status. Instead, his face reflected nothing but exhaustion. "Help," he gasped, falling to his knees. Rena hesitated. She had lived most of her life surrounded by Zethar nobles. But this human, This stranger was different. He didn't care about her title. He didn't look at her as a queen, but as a person. The unfamiliar feeling of being needed, being useful, stirred something inside Rena. She knelt beside him and placed her hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now," she said, her voice soft and steady. He didn't respond, but his breathing slowed as he seemed to regain some strength. Rena helped him to his feet, her mind racing with questions. Who was this man? How had he ended up on her moon? As they walked back toward the palace, Rena felt a strange connection forming between them. It was something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Perhaps this was the change she had been waiting for. Maybe this human could offer her something her people never had, companionship without expectations. But more importantly, he might just give her the strength to rise again. The human, Daniel, had fallen into a deep sleep once Rena helped him back to the palace. He was exhausted, his body clearly worn from whatever journey had led him to the barren moon. Rena's gaze lingered on him as he rested in the royal chamber. His chest rose and fell slowly, and for the first time in months, she felt a small sense of peace. She stood by the window, looking out at the dark expanse of space. It was strange to think that this foreigner had come to her world, uninvited and unaware of who she was. He had no idea of her past, or the reason she had been left to live in exile. Yet in some way, his arrival had rekindled something inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time: curiosity. The following morning, Daniel woke, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar room. For a moment, he seemed confused, his mind struggling to catch up with his surroundings. When he saw Rena standing by the window, he blinked in surprise. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice hoarse. He pushed himself up from the bed, still a little unsteady on his feet. "This is my home," Rena said softly. "You were injured when you arrived. I brought you here to heal." Daniel rubbed his temples as he tried to recall what had happened. He had been on a mission, exploring the far reaches of space. His ship had malfunctioned, and he crash-landed on the moon, never imagining anyone, let alone a woman, would find him. "Thank you," Daniel muttered. "I didn't expect to be saved by an alien queen." Rena's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "I am no queen anymore," she replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "I've been forgotten." Daniel studied her carefully. Her appearance was regal, even in her current state. She carried herself with the grace of someone who had once been admired. Yet there was a hidden sorrow in her eyes. He could tell that much. He had been trained to read people, to understand what they weren't saying. And this woman, this alien queen, had much more to her than her outward appearance. "Forgotten," Daniel repeated. "How?" Rena turned away from him, her back stiffening as she walked toward the window. The pain of her past lingered, but she didn't want to burden this stranger with her sorrow. She had been through enough years of loneliness to know when not to speak of certain things. "I am not of importance here anymore," Rena said, her voice quiet. "My people no longer need me." Daniel tilted his head, unsure of how to respond. It was clear that something much deeper was at play, but he had no way of knowing the full story. Instead, he chose to focus on the present moment. She had saved his life, after all. The least he could do was offer something in return. "Well, I'm here now," he said with a small smile. "I don't know if that helps, but I'm not going anywhere until I can get back to my ship." Rena gave him a small nod. "I'll help you, of course. There's a small device in the palace that might be able to send a signal to your people, but it may take some time for them to find us." Daniel nodded, the weight of the situation slowly settling in. He had hoped for a quick rescue, but now it seemed unlikely. He glanced around the room, taking in the luxurious surroundings. The palace was old, but it had a quiet elegance about it. There was something strangely calming about the place, despite its emptiness. "I'm not in a hurry," Daniel said after a moment. "It seems like I've got a lot of time on my hands now." Rena turned back to face him, surprised by the human's relaxed attitude. It was rare to find someone so unbothered by the circumstances. Most beings who ended up stranded in such a remote place would be frantic, but not Daniel. He seemed calm, almost as if he had accepted the situation. "I've spent much of my time alone here," Raina said, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "There is little to do on this moon. It's quiet, empty." Daniel's eyes softened. "I'm sorry. It can't be easy to be alone for so long." Raina didn't respond. She simply walked toward a small table and retrieved a pitcher of water. The palace, though empty, was well stocked with everything one could need. She poured them both a glass and handed one to Daniel. "Thank you," Daniel said, accepting the glass. He took a sip, feeling the cool liquid soothe his dry throat. The silence stretched between them for a moment before he spoke again. "So, what happens now?" he asked, his tone lighter. "What do you do out here?" Raina hesitated. She had spent years simply going through the motions, trying to distract herself from the hurt of being cast aside by the man she loved. But now, with Daniel here, she felt something stirring inside her. She hadn't realized how much she longed for conversation, for connection. "I don't know," she admitted. "I read, sometimes, explore the moon. Try to keep myself busy. There's a small garden outside, and I tend to it when I need something to occupy my mind." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds peaceful. I could use some peace right about now." Raina watched him, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Despite the difference in their species, she could sense something familiar in his words. He wasn't like the Zethar. He didn't care about rank or status. He was just a man, struggling to survive in a place that was as foreign to him as it was to her. "I suppose we're both stranded in our own way," Raina said. Daniel's expression softened. "Seems like it." There was a pause as the two of them shared a quiet understanding. Raina realized, for the first time in a long while, that she wasn't alone, not completely. The human had come into her life unexpectedly, and though she had no idea what his future held, she couldn't deny that his presence offered her something she hadn't had in years: hope. Daniel sat back in his chair, taking in the surroundings with a thoughtful gaze. "I don't know about you, but I think we can make the best of this situation. We might not have much, but we got time. And time is all we really need, right?" Raina regarded him thoughtfully, surprised by how much his simple words resonated with her. Maybe time, after all, was something that could change everything. As the day wore on, the two of them began to talk more. Daniel shared stories from his travels, tales of far-off places, and of his family back home. Raina, in turn, told him about the history of her people, the rise and fall of kings, and the ancient customs of the Zethar. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was truly being heard. And in that moment, she realized something important. She wasn't as forgotten as she had thought. The days passed quietly on the barren moon, and Raina began to adjust to her new life with Daniel. At first, they had spoken only when necessary, but over time, their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Daniel's stories about Earth, the human way of life, and the resilience of his people had a way of stirring something inside Raina. She found herself listening intently, eager to understand this strange, yet fascinating, human who had come into her life. It was a calm afternoon when the change began. Raina had been sitting by the window, watching the endless horizon of rock and dust, when Daniel approached her. He was carrying a small bundle of tools, his face serious but determined. He had been tinkering with a broken device in one of the side rooms, trying to figure out how to send a distress signal to his people. Raina had offered her help, but Daniel insisted that this was something he needed to do on his own. "Hey, Raina," Daniel called softly as he entered the room. "I think I've got the signal working. We'll be able to send a message soon." He smiled at her, his eyes bright with excitement. Raina stood up, her heart lifting at the thought of Daniel's return to his people. "That's wonderful news," she said, trying to hide the slight sadness in her voice. Though she was happy for him, part of her didn't want him to leave. For the first time in years, she had felt like someone truly cared about her. But she knew it was inevitable. He had a life waiting for him. He had family, friends, and a place to belong. Rena had nothing. "Yeah," Daniel said, still smiling. "But there's one problem. The signal is working, but it's weak. It'll take a few days for it to reach Earth." Rena frowned. "Days?" she asked, surprised. "But why so long?" Daniel shrugged, walking over to her. "The equipment here isn't exactly state-of-the-art. I'm surprised it's working at all." He looked at her and gave a small, apologetic smile. "I'll keep trying to improve it, but we have time." Rena looked out the window again, her thoughts turning inward. Time. The one thing she had in abundance, yet the one thing she couldn't seem to make use of. What could she do with all this time? She had spent so many years wallowing in the sadness of her situation, her mind consumed by the fact that the king had abandoned her. She had let the years slip away, wasted in grief. She had been a queen once, but now, what was she? A forgotten woman on a desolate moon. But Daniel's words had sparked something inside her. He was here, stranded just like her, but he wasn't sitting around feeling sorry for himself. He had fixed the signal, and now he was taking action. Maybe she could do the same. "I need your help," Rena said, surprising herself with her sudden determination. Daniel raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting for her to explain. I want to learn. To be stronger. To do something with my time. You've been teaching me about humans, and how you all adapt, survive, and move forward. But I haven't really learned anything." Daniel's expression softened. "What do you mean, learn?" Rena looked at him, her eyes serious. "You're strong, Daniel. I've seen it in the way you face every challenge without hesitation. I've spent my life hiding behind my royal title, but it hasn't made me strong. It's made me weak. I want to change that." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze studying her face. "You're strong already, Rena," he said finally, his voice gentle. "But if you want to learn more, I'll help you." Rena nodded, feeling the spark of hope igniting in her chest. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was merely surviving. She felt like she was beginning to live again. Over the next few days, Daniel shared more about human resilience, strength, and survival. He taught her about problem solving, adaptability, and how to view challenges as opportunities. They spent hours walking around the moon's surface, where Daniel showed her how to make use of the resources available. He explained how humans had learned to thrive in even the harshest environments, from the icy tundras of Earth to the vast deserts. Rena listened, eager to absorb everything he taught her. One afternoon, they ventured into the nearby caves, a series of ancient formations that Rena had never explored. The caves were dark and cold, but Daniel seemed completely at ease. He led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating the strange rock formations and hidden paths. "This is a good place to practice," Daniel said as they reached a small cavern. "We'll start with something simple. Survival skills." Rena raised an eyebrow. "Survival skills." Daniel nodded. "You're going to learn how to survive on your own, if you ever have to. It's important to know how to make the most of what you have." He taught her how to start a fire with limited resources, how to find water in an unfamiliar environment, and how to create shelter from the elements. Rena found the lessons challenging but invigorating. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about her past. She was focused on the present, on learning and growing. As the days went on, Rena began to see herself in a new light. She wasn't just a woman abandoned by her husband. She wasn't just the former queen of a fallen kingdom. She was a person who could change, who could adapt. She had the power to shape her future, regardless of the past. Daniel noticed the change in her too. Her posture was straighter, her movements more confident. The woman who had once seemed distant and broken was now standing tall, her eyes full of determination. "You're doing great," Daniel said one evening, as they sat around a small campfire. "I knew you had it in you." Rena smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." Daniel returned her smile, his eyes warm. "You don't need to thank me. You've done all the work." As the fire crackled, Rena realized something important. Strength wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming the power within oneself. It was about not letting the past define the future. And for the first time in years, Rena felt that power stir within her. The sunless days passed, and Rena found herself looking at her life in a new way. Daniel's presence on the moon had brought change, and not just because of his rescue efforts. He had shown her what it meant to move forward, to adapt, to take charge of one's life. He had helped her rediscover the strength that had once been buried under years of sadness and loss. Now, as Rena stood in the palace garden, she realized she was no longer the woman who had once been abandoned. She was someone else, someone stronger. She had spent countless hours exploring the barren landscape with Daniel, learning to survive, to build, and to think in ways she had never imagined before. They would spend the mornings outside, walking across the rocky terrain, Daniel teaching her about human survival tactics. By the afternoon, they would return to the palace, where Rena would practice her newfound skills, each day gaining more confidence. Today was no different. They were preparing to build a small shelter near the edge of the garden, a place where they could store supplies for emergencies. Rena had suggested the idea after noticing how much Daniel enjoyed working with his hands. At first, he had been hesitant, saying it wasn't necessary. But she insisted, and slowly he had come around to the idea. "Ready to start?" Daniel asked, his face lit up with enthusiasm. Rena nodded, picking up a heavy stone. It was strange how, just a few days ago, she would have found this task impossible. Now she didn't think twice about it. The work wasn't easy, but it felt good, like she was reclaiming something she had lost. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. As the day went on, they worked together, moving large stones and arranging them in a circle. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them felt comfortable. It wasn't the loneliness that had plagued Rena for so many years, but rather a quiet understanding that they were both learning from each other. Rena looked up at the sky, noticing that the pale light was beginning to fade as the day turned into evening. They had made significant progress, and it was clear that the shelter would be finished soon. But there was something else on Rena's mind, something that had been bothering her for the past few days. It wasn't just the work or the lessons. It was the lingering question of what would happen when Daniel's signal finally reached Earth. She had never asked him much about his world, but she knew enough. Daniel was from Earth, a place full of people, of life. He had a family. He had a purpose. And one day, when the signal was strong enough, someone would come for him. Someone would take him home, and she would be alone again. The thought weighed heavily on her heart. She had grown so close to Daniel in such a short time. His kindness, his strength, had become a source of comfort. But she had seen the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of Earth. She had seen the way he missed his home, his family. He had a life waiting for him, a life beyond this lonely moon. As they continued to work, Rena couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away. She couldn't deny the bond that had grown between them, but she couldn't ignore the truth either. Daniel would leave. He had to. Later that evening, after the shelter had been completed, they sat down to rest, their tired muscles aching from the day's work. Rena stared into the small fire that flickered between them, the warm glow casting shadows on her face. Daniel spoke first, breaking the silence. "We've done good work today, Rena. I think this shelter will hold up pretty well." Rena smiled faintly but didn't reply immediately. Her mind was elsewhere, her thoughts tangled in the emotion she had been trying to keep at bay. After a long moment, she turned to him. "Daniel, what happens when your people find you?" Daniel's face softened, a slight sadness in his eyes. "When they find me, I go home. I return to Earth." He paused for a moment, his gaze distant. "But I won't forget what I've learned here. I won't forget you." Rena swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump that had suddenly formed in her throat. She had known this was coming, but hearing the words out loud made it all the more real. Daniel would leave, and she would be alone once again. "I understand," Rena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what will I do when you're gone?" Daniel looked at her, his expression gentle. "You'll keep going. You've learned so much already. You're stronger than you think, Rena. You don't need anyone to tell you that. You've got it in you." Rena looked away, her eyes fixed on the fire. The warmth from the flames didn't reach the cold knot in her chest. She had come to depend on Daniel, his companionship, his presence, and the thought of losing that was almost too much to bear. But there was something else she realized in that moment. As much as she had relied on Daniel, as much as she had found comfort in his company, the strength she had been searching for all along was inside her. She didn't need to wait for someone to save her, to show her the way. She had the power to shape her future. She had the power to move forward, just as Daniel had taught her. Rena turned back to him, her eyes clear and firm. "You're right," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I don't need anyone to tell me who I am. I've spent too much time waiting for someone else to decide my fate." Daniel smiled, a proud gleam in his eyes. "That's the spirit. I knew you had it in you." Rena looked up at the stars above, her mind racing with possibilities. She wasn't going to wait for someone to save her anymore. She wasn't going to waste her time dwelling on the past. She was going to move forward, to make the most of her time on this moon, no matter how long she had. As she sat beside Daniel, the fire flickering between them, she knew that her journey was far from over. She had learned to survive, to adapt, and now she was ready to build a new life. It might not be the life she had once imagined, but it was hers to create. And for the first time in a long time, Rena felt hope. The days stretched on, and as Rena and Daniel continued their work, a silent understanding grew between them. The shelter was completed, and the signal had grown stronger, but there was still no word from Earth. Rena could see that Daniel was starting to feel the weight of waiting. His eyes would often wander to the sky, as if trying to will his people to arrive sooner. But Rena was changing. The lessons, the shared experiences, and the quiet nights spent around the campfire had done more than help her survive. They had sparked something within her, something powerful and undeniable. She wasn't the same woman who had once been cast aside by her people. She was someone new, someone who had the strength to decide her own fate. It was an early morning when Daniel came to her, looking unusually serious. He had been up since before dawn, working on the signal equipment again, and Rena could tell that something was on his mind. "Rena," he began, his voice softer than usual. "I think it's time we have a conversation." Rena looked up from where she was sitting, tending to the small garden she had started. The garden was growing well, despite the harsh conditions of the moon. She had learned to make the most of the limited resources available to her. It was a small victory, but to her, it was a symbol of her newfound independence. "Of course," she said, wiping her hands on her clothes and standing up. "What's on your mind?" Daniel hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his eyes meeting hers. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About Earth, about my family, and about everything that's happened here. I've been stuck in this waiting game, hoping my people will come for me. But I don't know if I can just wait anymore." Rena's heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment would come, the moment when Daniel would have to choose his future. She had expected it, but hearing him say the words aloud made it feel all too real. "I understand," Rena said, her voice steady despite the tightening in her chest. "You have a life waiting for you. You can't stay here forever." Daniel looked at her with a mixture of sadness and determination. "It's not that simple. I don't want to leave you alone. You've become my friend. I don't know what I'd do without you. But I also know that I can't just wait forever. I have to make a choice." Rena took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the internal struggle that mirrored her own. She had been wrestling with her own choices, about what she wanted her life to be now that she had learned to survive and thrive on her own. "I can't make the decision for you," Rhaena said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I think you already know what you have to do." Daniel looked at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" Rhaena took a step toward him, her eyes locking onto his. "You can't stay here for me. You have to go back to Earth. You have your family. You have a life there, and you deserve to go back to it. I've learned so much because of you. I'm not the same woman I was before. I'm strong now. I can survive on my own." Daniel's eyes softened, and he reached out to place a hand on her shoulder. "Rhaena, I don't want to leave you behind. You've helped me so much. I'm not sure I'd be here if it weren't for you." Rhaena smiled gently, her heart heavy with emotions she couldn't quite express. "And you've helped me more than you know. But this isn't just about us anymore, Daniel. It's about our futures. We both have paths we need to follow. I can't hold you back." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them. The weight of their unspoken words hung in the air, but neither of them spoke. The moment stretched on, and finally, Daniel took a deep breath and nodded. "You're right," he said quietly. "I have to go back. But I'll never forget what you've done for me. And I'll never forget you." Rhaena felt a lump form in her throat. She nodded, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. "I won't forget you either." That afternoon, the two of them set to work on one last task together. They repaired the signal equipment one final time, ensuring it would be strong enough to reach Earth. Daniel worked with a quiet determination, while Rhaena stood by, offering help where she could. It was clear that they were both preparing for something that neither of them could control. When the signal was finally ready, Daniel activated it, and the soft hum of the equipment filled the air. "Now we wait," he said, his voice quieter than before. Rhaena nodded, her eyes gazing out into the distance. She had spent so much of her life waiting for someone to come and rescue her, to give her a reason to keep going. But now, she realized, she didn't need anyone to rescue her. She had rescued herself. They spent the next few days in quiet anticipation. Daniel continued to work on his equipment, fine-tuning the signal, while Rhaena focused on her garden and her training. The days were peaceful, but the undercurrent of change was always there. They both knew that soon their paths would diverge. And when they did, Rhaena would face the future alone once more. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She had learned what it meant to live again, to survive, to be strong. She had built a life on this desolate moon, not just for herself, but with Daniel by her side. And though their time together was ending, the lesson she had learned would stay with her forever. As the day finally arrived when the signal was strong enough to reach Earth, Daniel prepared to leave. Rhaena stood at the edge of the palace garden, watching as he packed the last of his things. He turned to her one final time. "I'll never forget you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Rhaena smiled, a bittersweet smile. "And I won't forget you either." With one last look, Daniel turned and made his way toward the shuttle. Rhaena stood there, her heart heavy, but her spirit strong. She watched him disappear into the distance, knowing that their journey together had come to an end. But hers was just beginning. The shuttle carrying Daniel disappeared into the horizon, leaving only the quiet stillness of the moon behind. Rhaena stood there for a long time, watching, her heart heavy. She had told herself that she would be fine, that she didn't need anyone to complete her. But now that Daniel was gone, a sense of loneliness crept over her like a shadow. She stood there for hours, until the sunless sky above began to shift into the deep colors of night. The wind whispered through the barren landscape, but all Rhaena could hear was the silence of her own thoughts. She had said goodbye, but the feeling of loss had not yet faded. Slowly, she turned and walked back to the palace. Her steps were heavy, but there was a calmness in her that had not been there before. She had given Daniel the freedom he needed, the chance to return home to his family, to his life. But now it was her turn to decide what she would do next. Inside the palace, the echoes of its once glorious halls seemed quieter now. The walls, once filled with the laughter of courtiers and the bustle of royal affairs, now stood still. Rena walked through the corridors, her fingers grazing the cold stone, remembering a time when she had been surrounded by people. Back then, she had been the queen. Now she was just a woman, an ordinary woman with no kingdom, no throne. Yet, in the silence of the palace, something stirred inside her. The strength Daniel had helped her rediscover was still there. The survival skills, the knowledge of how to thrive even in the harshest conditions, were now a part of her. And no matter how much the palace around her had fallen into decay, she was not going to let herself crumble along with it. She made her way to the garden that she had begun cultivating. The plants were small but growing strong, just like her. Each time she tended to them, she felt a sense of peace, a connection to the land. The act of caring for something, of nurturing it, had become a way for her to heal. And now, standing there among the budding flowers and plants, Rena realized that she had not just learned to survive. She had learned to live again. She knelt beside the plants, carefully watering them as she thought about the future. Her past had been defined by others. The king, the people, the expectations placed on her as a queen. But now she realized that she had the power to define her future. The choice was hers, and hers alone. Rena had always been a survivor, but survival was no longer enough. She wanted to live with purpose. She wanted to do something that mattered. She had spent so much time thinking about the past, about the kingdom she had lost. But now it was time to focus on what was ahead. As the days turned into weeks, Rena settled into a new rhythm. She spent her mornings in the garden, tending to the plants, and her afternoons continuing her lessons in survival and independence. She didn't just practice the skills Daniel had taught her. She began to refine them, making them her own. She would climb the steep cliffs, gather resources from the barren land, and practice setting up shelters, all the while gaining more confidence in her abilities. One day, as she was climbing one of the rocky hills, she spotted something in the distance. It was a small group of figures, moving across the landscape. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be Daniel, returning with the rescue team? But as she squinted, she realized it was not him. Instead, the group was made up of travelers, people who appeared to be from a different planet. Their clothing was unlike anything Rena had ever seen, and their movements were cautious, as if they, too, were trying to make sense of the strange land. Rena hesitated for a moment. Should she approach them, or should she wait and observe from a distance? The lessons of survival that Daniel had taught her filled her mind. She knew how to stay hidden if necessary, but she also knew how to approach with caution and intelligence. She chose to walk toward them, slowly, with purpose. As she drew closer, the travelers noticed her and paused, their eyes wary but not aggressive. She stopped a few yards away, carefully assessing the situation. "Hello," she called, her voice steady but unsure. "Who are you?" The travelers exchanged glances, and one of them, a tall figure with dark skin and bright eyes, stepped forward. "We are from the planet Eldrith. We're explorers. We were lost, but we finally managed to find our way back. We never expected to find anyone here." Rena's heart raced. Eldrith. She had heard of the planet, a distant world known for its advanced technology and peaceful ways. She had never imagined she would meet anyone from there. The travelers, like Daniel, were stranded, cut off from their home. And here they were, in the same place she had once considered her prison. "Eldrith," Rena repeated, her voice filled with curiosity. "I've been living here for some time now. I thought I was the only one." The traveler nodded. "It seems you are not alone after all. We've been searching for a way off this planet for years, but our technology failed us. It seems we're all stuck here." Rena's mind began to race. She had spent so long in isolation, so long thinking she was alone in this place. But now, standing before these travelers, she realized that there were others who had experienced the same loneliness, the same feeling of being lost. This planet, it's harsh, but it can also be beautiful. "There's much to learn from it," Rena said, her voice growing more confident. and I've learned how to survive here. I can teach you." The travelers looked at each other, surprised by her offer. But then they nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. They were not alone anymore. Rena, once the abandoned queen, had found her new purpose: to help those in need, to share what she had learned, and to build something with others who understood her journey. In that moment, Rena knew that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And the road ahead, though uncertain, was one she was ready to walk, one step at a time. The days that followed Rena's encounter with the travelers were filled with a new energy. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of connection, not just to the land around her, but to the people who shared her experiences. The travelers from Eldrith were cautious but eager to learn, and Rena, with her newfound strength and independence, was ready to share everything she had learned. The first thing Rena did was teach them how to survive on the moon. She showed them how to build shelters using the materials available, how to find food in a harsh environment, and how to purify the water from the deep wells they had discovered. It wasn't easy, but Rena was patient, understanding that each lesson took time. As she worked with the travelers, she saw in them the same uncertainty she had once felt, the fear of being lost, of being alone. But with each passing day, they grew stronger, more capable. In return, the travelers shared their knowledge with Rena. They taught her about the stars, about the distant planets and cultures they had visited. They spoke of their homeworld, Eldrith, and the wonders of its advanced technology. Rena listened intently, fascinated by the stories they told. For the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of curiosity about the universe beyond the moon. As the weeks went by, the small group began to take shape. They were not just survivors anymore. They were a community, one built on trust, cooperation, and shared experiences. Rena found herself growing closer to the travelers, each one becoming a part of her new family. There was Sol, the tall figure who had first stepped forward to speak with her, and Kira, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and a quick mind. They had both become Rena's closest allies, working alongside her to make their lives here better. The days were hard, but they were fulfilling. They worked together, laughing together, and facing the challenges of the moon as a team. Rena was no longer the isolated woman who had once been abandoned by her people. She was a leader, a teacher, and a friend. And with every passing day, the land around them seemed a little less desolate, a little more alive. But despite the growing sense of community, Rena knew there were still many unanswered questions. The signal from Earth had not yet reached them, and she could feel the weight of that unknown hanging over her. The travelers spoke of possible ways to fix their technology, of hoping to reach their homeworld someday, but Rena's thoughts often returned to Daniel. She wondered if he had made it back to Earth, if he was reunited with his family, or if he, too, was still waiting for someone to find him. One evening, as the group sat around the fire, Rena couldn't help but bring up the topic. She had kept it to herself for so long, but the question had been gnawing at her for weeks. "Do you ever think about what's out there?" she asked, looking around at the group, "about what might be waiting for us beyond this moon?" Sol looked up at the stars, his face thoughtful. "Every day," he said. "Eldrith is home, but there are so many other places, other worlds. I wonder what else is out there." Kira nodded. "I've been thinking about Earth. I wonder if we'll ever get there. I wonder if they've even noticed we're gone." The conversation turned into a quiet discussion about the possibility of exploring the universe once more. The travelers shared their dreams of seeing the stars, of returning to their people. But Rena, though she listened, couldn't help but think that her place was here now. The moon, the place she had once feared, had become her home. She had built a life here, a community, a purpose, and while the thought of exploring the stars was tempting, she realized that there was no longer any hurry. She had found what she had been searching for all along. The next morning, Rena woke with a sense of clarity. She knew what she needed to do. She gathered the travelers together and explained her decision. "I know we've all been thinking about returning to our worlds, to what we left behind. But I've realized something. This place, this moon, has become home to us. We've made something here. We've built something from nothing. And I don't want to leave that behind. Sol and Kira exchanged glances, then nodded. You're right, Sol said. We've come a long way, and we've learned so much. Maybe it's time to make this our new beginning. Rena smiled, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. This was her new beginning. It wasn't the life she had once imagined, but it was a life she had chosen for herself. And she wasn't alone. She had a new family, one forged by the shared experience of survival. And now, they would build something more, something lasting. Over the next few months, the small community continued to thrive. The travelers helped Rena establish a new system for growing food, and together, they built better shelters and more advanced tools. They had no plans of leaving the moon anytime soon, but they were determined to make their lives here as comfortable as possible. Rena had found peace in a way she had never thought possible. The land that had once felt barren and cold now felt full of promise. The moon, which had once been a place of isolation and fear, had become a symbol of resilience and hope. Rena, the abandoned queen, had become a leader in her own right, no longer defined by her past, but by the choices she had made. And though the future was still uncertain, one thing was clear. Rena was no longer waiting for someone else to give her purpose. She had found it for herself. And as she stood with her new family, looking out over the horizon, she knew that the road ahead was one she was ready to walk. Together,